The gunshot echoed across the dusty main street of Boise, Idaho Territory, causing Harriet Dawson to drop the basket of eggs she'd been carrying to her father's general store. It was 1876, and the sound of gunfire wasn't exactly rare in a frontier town, but it never failed to make her heart race. She stood frozen, amber yolks pooling around her boots, watching as a man emerged from the saloon, swagger in his step despite the blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. Vance Yates, the most notorious cowboy in the county and the last man on earth Harriet would ever consider spending time with, much less marrying. "Miss Dawson," he drawled, tipping his hat as if he hadn't just been involved in whatever commotion had erupted inside the silver dollar. His dark eyes assessed the ruined eggs at her feet. "Seems I've startled you." "You've cost me $1's worth of eggs, Mr. Yates," Harriet said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. At 22, she prided herself on maintaining composure, even when faced with men like Vance Yates, especially when faced with men like him. "I'll pay for them," he offered, reaching into his pocket. "I don't want your blood money," she replied, gathering her skirts and stepping around the mess. "I want nothing from you." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Strong words for someone who's barely exchanged 10 with me before today. Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Yates. Now, if you'll excuse me." She moved to walk past him, but he shifted, blocking her path. "My reputation. And what might that be?" Harriet looked up at him, taking in the lean hardness of his face, the slight shadow of stubble on his jaw, and the intensity of his gaze. At 28, Vance Yates had a face that told stories, not all of them pleasant. Troublemaker. Gambler. Man who cares more about horses than people. She paused. "Need I continue? You forgot best cattle driver in the territory," he added with a grin that might have been charming if Harriet had been inclined to be charmed. "Good day, Mr. Yates." She stepped around him decisively and continued toward her father's store, feeling his eyes on her back the entire way. Harriet had lived in Boise her entire life, watching it grow from a small mining settlement to a proper town as Idaho Territory developed. Her father, Thomas Dawson, had opened one of the first general stores and prospered as the town expanded. Now, at 55, he was considering retirement, and Harriet, his only child since her mother and baby brother had died of fever 12 years ago, was expected to marry someone suitable who could take over the business. The problem was, Harriet had no intention of marrying anyone, suitable or otherwise. She had plans of her own plans that involved running the store herself and eventually opening a second location in the growing settlement of Eagle, 15 miles to the west. She pushed open the door to Dawson's general store, the bell jingling cheerfully above her head. "Where are the eggs?" her father asked from behind the counter where he was tallying the day's receipts. "Broken," Harriet replied shortly. "There was a disturbance at the saloon. A gunshot." Thomas Dawson looked up, alarm crossing his weathered face. "Anyone hurt?" "Just Mr. Yates's face, it seems." She hung her bonnet on a peg by the door. "And my dignity when he offered to pay for the eggs," her father sighed. "That Yates boy, always in the middle of something." He shook his head. "Though I'll grant he's built himself a respectable ranch. His cattle fetch top dollar at market. Please don't tell me you're adding him to your list of suitable husbands," Harriet said, moving behind the counter to help organize a new shipment of fabric. "He's not on any list," her father assured her, "though you could do worse than a man with 5,000 acres and a growing herd. I could also do better than a man who seems to find himself in a brawl every other week." She began sorting through bolts of calico. "Besides, I've told you my plans. I don't need a husband to run this store." Thomas closed his ledger with a snap. "Harriet, we've been through this. A woman alone running a business is perfectly capable, she finished. Look at Mrs. Miller with her millinery shop or Mrs. Whittaker with the boarding house. Both widows, her father pointed out, who had husbands to establish those businesses first. Harriet bit back a retort, knowing this argument would lead nowhere productive. She'd been having the same disagreement with her father for months now. We have the Founders' Day celebration coming up, Thomas said, changing the subject. The committee meeting is tonight at the schoolhouse. I expect you'll attend, of course. Harriet nodded. The annual celebration marked the founding of boys and was the town's biggest social event of the year. As members of one of the founding families, the Dawsons were expected to take a leading role. The bell over the door jingled again, and both Harriet and her father looked up to see Sheriff Mills enter, his expression grim beneath his mustache. "Thomas, Miss Harriet," he nodded to them both. "I'm afraid I'm here on official business. There was a disturbance at the Silver Dollar earlier, a disagreement between Vance Yates and Edgar Thompson." "We heard the shot," Thomas said. "No one seriously injured, I hope." "No, thank the Lord." "But I need to speak with you about your involvement, Thomas." "My involvement?" Thomas looked genuinely puzzled. "I haven't set foot in the Silver Dollar in weeks." Sheriff Mills shifted uncomfortably. "It seems the disagreement was over a debt. Thompson claims you owe him $500 from a business arrangement gone sour, and he was demanding that Yates collect it, since Yates apparently handles some of Thompson's affairs." Harriet watched the color drain from her father's face. "That's ridiculous," she said firmly. "My father doesn't owe anyone money, least of all Edgar Thompson." But Thomas was suddenly very interested in straightening items on the counter. "Thank you for letting me know, Sheriff. I'll speak with Mr. Thompson directly to clear up any misunderstanding." The sheriff nodded, clearly relieved not to be in the middle of what appeared to be a private matter. "See that you do, Thomas. I don't want any more gunplay in my town over this." With a tip of his hat, he departed. Harriet turned to her father the moment the door closed. "What was that about?" "What business could you possibly have with Edgar Thompson?" Edgar Thompson was known throughout the county as a shrewd, some would say ruthless businessman who had made his fortune in mining and cattle, and was now one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Thomas sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 55 years. "It's nothing for you to worry about, Harriet, just a small business matter." "A small business matter that has men shooting at each other in the middle of town," Harriet pressed. $500 is hardly small, Father. That's more than the store makes in 2 months. "I said it's nothing for you to worry about," Thomas repeated more firmly. "Now I have inventory to check in the storeroom." He disappeared through the curtained doorway, leaving Harriet staring after him, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. Her father had never kept secrets from her before, especially not about the business. Something was very wrong. The rest of the day passed in a blur of customers and chores, with Thomas avoiding any further discussion of Sheriff Mills's visit. By the time they closed the store at 6 o'clock, Harriet was determined to get answers, but her father claimed a headache and retired to their rooms above the store, asking her to attend the Founders' Day Committee meeting alone. The schoolhouse was already buzzing with activity when Harriet arrived. Most of the town's prominent citizens were there: Mayor Wilson and his wife, Reverend Parker, Dr. Holloway and his daughter Clara, and several business owners, including Mrs. Miller from the millinery and Mr. Perkins from the bank. Harriet took a seat near the back, nodding politely to acquaintances, but not feeling particularly sociable. Her mind was still preoccupied with her father's strange behavior and the revelation of a supposed debt to Edgar Thompson. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up, startled to find Vance Yates standing beside her, gesturing to the empty chair. The cut on his cheek had been cleaned but was starting to bruise. "I didn't realize you were on the committee, Mr. Yates," she said, neither inviting him to sit nor telling him to leave. "I'm not," he admitted, sitting down anyway. "But as a business owner in the county, I thought I should make an appearance, show community spirit and all that." Harriet doubted that was his real reason for attending, but before she could respond, Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order. "Now, as you all know, this year's Founders' Day celebration marks the 20th anniversary of our fair city," the mayor began pompously. "And we want to make it the grandest celebration yet." As he droned on about parade routes and pie contests, Harriet was acutely aware of Vance beside her. He sat with the relaxed confidence of a man accustomed to taking up space, his long legs stretched out before him, hat resting on his knee. "Your father didn't come?" he asked in a low voice. "He wasn't feeling well," she replied shortly. Vance nodded. "Understandable, given the circumstances." Harriet turned to face him fully. "And what circumstances would those be, Mr. Yates?" He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "You don't know, do you?" "Know what?" she demanded, keeping her voice low as Mayor Wilson continued outlining plans for a shooting competition. Vance shook his head slightly. "It's not my place to say. But you might want to ask your father about his poker games with Edgar Thompson." Harriet felt as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. Her father didn't gamble. He considered it a sin and a waste of hard-earned money. He had lectured her countless times on the evils of the saloon and the gambling that went on there. "You're lying," she hissed. "I have no reason to lie to you, Miss Dawson," Vance replied evenly, "but I do have reason to be concerned. Thompson isn't a man who forgives debts, and he's becoming impatient. So impatient that he asked you to collect. Is that why there was gunfire today?" "Not exactly." Vance's mouth twitched. "Thompson suggested I might want to take an interest in your father's situation. I suggested he mind his own business. Things escalated from there." "Why would you care about my father's affairs?" Harriet asked, genuinely confused. Vance didn't answer immediately, his attention seemingly drawn to the front, where the mayor was now discussing the dance that would conclude the celebration. "Let's just say I have a personal interest in ensuring Thompson doesn't add your father's store to his collection of properties," he finally said. "The man already owns half the county." Before Harriet could press for more information, Mrs. Wilson's shrill voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "Miss Dawson, Mr. Yates, since you two seem so engrossed in your own discussion, perhaps you'd like to volunteer to organize the dance." All eyes turned to them, and Harriet felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'd be delighted," she said quickly, knowing it was expected of her. "Though I'm sure Mr. Yates has more important matters to attend to." "Not at all," Vance drawled, a smile spreading across his face. "I'd be honored to work with Miss Dawson on such an important community event." Mrs. Wilson beamed. "Wonderful. It's settled then. The dance will be in your capable hands." Harriet shot Vance a look that promised retribution, but he merely winked at her, seemingly enjoying her discomfort. The rest of the meeting passed without incident, though Harriet found it difficult to concentrate. Her mind kept returning to Vance's revelation about her father and Edgar Thompson, and the implications of a gambling debt large enough to potentially cost them their store and livelihood. As soon as the meeting concluded, Harriet gathered her things, intent on getting home to confront her father, but Vance caught up with her on the schoolhouse steps. "Miss Dawson, a moment of your time." "I have nothing more to say to you, Mr. Yates," she replied, continuing down the steps. He fell into step beside her. "Then perhaps you'll listen. Thompson gave your father until the end of the Founders' Day celebration to settle his debt. That's 10 days from now. Harriet stopped walking and turned to face him. "And how do you know this?" "I make it my business to know what Thompson is up to," Vance said. "The man has been trying to force smaller ranchers and businesses out of the area for years. Your father's store is prime real estate, right on the main street. If what you're saying is true, and I'm not convinced it is, why are you involving yourself? What do you care if Edgar Thompson adds another property to his holdings?" Vance's expression hardened. "Thompson foreclosed on my parents' ranch when I was 16. My father took his own life rather than face the shame. My mother died of pneumonia that winter because we couldn't afford a doctor. So you could say I have a personal grudge against the man." Harriet was momentarily stunned by his candor. She'd heard whispers about the Yates family tragedy years ago, but had never known the details. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That's terrible, but it doesn't explain why you're specifically concerned about my father's situation." "Let's just say I don't like to see history repeat itself," Vance replied. "And I don't like to see good people lose everything to a snake like Thompson. So this is, what, some kind of personal crusade against Thompson?" Vance's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Something like that." "Well, I appreciate your concern, misplaced as it may be," Harriet said, gathering her composure. "But I need to speak with my father directly. Good night, Mr. Yates." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her again. "There might be a way to help your father without him losing the store," Vance called after her. Against her better judgment, Harriet turned back. "What way?" Vance approached her, his expression serious. "Thompson has been trying to buy my water rights for the past year. My ranch controls access to the best stretch of the Boys River for miles. He's offered substantial money, but I've refused. And this helps my father how? I could sell those rights to Thompson in exchange for him forgiving your father's debt," Vance explained. Harriet stared at him. "Why would you do that? You just said those water rights are valuable." "They are, very valuable," Vance agreed, "which is why I'd need something in return." "What?" Harriet asked, immediately suspicious. Vance looked at her steadily. "Marriage." For a moment Harriet was certain she'd misheard him. "Excuse me, marriage," Vance repeated. "You and me. I give up my water rights to save your father's store and you become Mrs. Vance Yates." Harriet let out a startled laugh. "You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious," Vance replied, no trace of humor in his expression. "It's a practical arrangement. You need to save your father's store and I need a wife." "You need a wife," Harriet repeated incredulously. "And why is that exactly?" "My grandfather's will," Vance explained. "He left the ranch to me with the stipulation that I must be married by my 30th birthday or the property goes to my cousin in California. I turned 30 in 2 months. And you waited until now to find a bride." Harriet couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Vance shrugged. "I've been busy building the ranch into something worthwhile. Besides, most women in these parts aren't interested in marrying a man with my reputation." "I can't imagine why," Harriet said dryly. "Mr. Yates, your proposal, if one can call it that, is absurd. I don't even like you." "You don't know me," he countered. "And I'm not asking you to love me, Miss Dawson. I'm offering a business arrangement that benefits us both. A business arrangement that involves me spending the rest of my life with a man I barely know and certainly don't trust." Harriet shook her head. "No, thank you. I'll find another way to help my father." "There is no other way," Vance said bluntly. "Not in 10 days. Thompson wants your father's store, and he'll get it one way or another unless something of equal or greater value is offered in its place." Harriet wanted to argue, to insist he was wrong, but a sinking feeling in her stomach told her he might be right. $500 was an impossible sum for them to raise so quickly. "I need to speak with my father," she said finally. Vance nodded. "Of course. But don't take too long to decide. Thompson isn't a patient man. This isn't a decision I'm going to make, Mr. Yates, Harriet said firmly. It's an absurd proposition that I'm going to discuss with my father solely to understand the full situation. Good night. She turned and walked away quickly, her mind racing. The thought of marrying Vance Yates was preposterous. He was exactly the kind of man she had always avoided, dangerous, unpredictable, with a reputation for trouble. The fact that he was undeniably handsome with his tall, lean frame and intense dark eyes only made him more dangerous. No, marrying Vance Yates was out of the question. There had to be another way to save her father's store if indeed it needed saving at all. Perhaps this was all an elaborate scheme on Vance's part, though she couldn't imagine what he would gain from it. With determination in her step, Harriet headed home to get the truth from her father, once and for all. Thomas Dawson was still awake when Harriet returned, sitting in his armchair by the window overlooking the main street, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He rarely drank, which only confirmed Harriet's suspicions that something was very wrong. "Father," she said, hanging her shawl on the hook by the door, "we need to talk." Thomas looked up, his expression weary. "How was the meeting?" "Informative," Harriet replied, taking the chair opposite him. "In more ways than one. I've been asked to organize the Founders' Day dance with Vance Yates." Her father raised an eyebrow. "Vance Yates attended a town meeting. That's unusual." "Yes, it is." Harriet fixed him with a steady gaze. "Almost as unusual as my father keeping secrets from me." "Tell me about your debt to Edgar Thompson." Thomas's face fell, and he took a long swallow of whiskey before responding. "How did you find out?" "Sheriff Mills mentioned it this afternoon, and Mr. Yates filled in some of the details after the meeting." She leaned forward. "Is it true?" "Do you owe Thompson $500? Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Yes, from gambling," Harriet pressed, still finding it hard to believe. "From poker, yes." Thomas looked at her directly. "I'm not proud of it, Harriet. It started innocently enough, a friendly game at the Cattlemen's Association meeting last fall. I won a small sum and found I enjoyed the thrill of it." "So you kept playing," Harriet said, her voice flat. Thomas nodded. "Once a month at first, then more frequently. I was winning more often than not, until I wasn't." He sighed heavily. "Thompson suggested I could win back my losses if I just kept playing. Before I knew it, I owed him $500 with no way to pay. The store is barely breaking even these days," Thomas admitted. "With the new mercantile that opened in Eagle taking some of our business, and last year's poor harvest affecting how much farmers can spend. We're not in the position I've led you to believe." Harriet felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. All her plans, all her dreams of expanding the business were built on a foundation that apparently didn't exist. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, hurt evident in her voice. "I didn't want you to worry," Thomas said. "I thought I could fix it, win back the money. And when that didn't work, I tried to negotiate with Thompson for more time. And now he wants payment by the end of the Founders' Day celebration," Harriet said, remembering Vance's words. Thomas looked surprised. "Yates told you that?" "He seems to know a great deal about Thompson's business," Harriet said. "He also made me an offer." Quickly, she explained Vance's proposition, his water rights in exchange for Thompson forgiving the debt, with the condition that Harriet marry him. Thomas listened in silence, his expression growing more troubled as she spoke. When she finished, he shook his head slowly. "That's no solution, Harriet. I won't have you sacrificing your future for my mistakes. It's not just your future at stake, Father. It's mine, too. This store is my inheritance, my livelihood." She hesitated. "And Mr. Yates's ranch is supposedly quite successful. It wouldn't be the worst match in the world." "You can't seriously be considering his offer," Thomas said, looking alarmed. The man is trouble, Harriet, always has been. He also seems to be the only person willing and able to help us, Harriet pointed out. Unless you have another solution. Thomas looked down at his empty glass. I've written to your Uncle James in Denver. He might be able to send the money, but I doubt it will arrive in time. So we either accept Mr. Yates's offer or lose the store, Harriet summarized. Or I speak to Thompson again, try to negotiate more time, Thomas suggested, though he didn't sound hopeful. From what Mr. Yates said, Thompson isn't interested in more time. He wants your store. Harriet stood up, her mind racing. I need to think about this. We both do. Harriet, Thomas called as she moved toward her bedroom. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. She turned back to look at her father, seeing not the strong, principled man who had raised her, but an aging, fallible human who had made a terrible mistake. I know, Father. We'll figure this out. Somehow. But as she closed her bedroom door behind her, Harriet wasn't at all sure that there was a way out of this mess that didn't involve either losing everything or tying herself to a man. She barely knew a man with a reputation that made him the last person she would ever have chosen for a husband. Sleep eluded Harriet that night as she weighed her options. By morning, she had made up her mind. After a quiet breakfast with her father, she told him she was going to visit Clara Holloway, the doctor's daughter and one of her closest friends, before opening the store. Instead, she walked purposefully toward the Silver Dollar Saloon. At 8 in the morning, the establishment was closed, but Harriet knew the owner, Mr. Donovan, lived in rooms at the back. She knocked firmly on the side door. After a moment, a bleary-eyed Mr. Donovan opened the door, his suspenders hanging down around his waist and his hair standing on end. Miss Dawson, he said, clearly shocked to see her on his doorstep. Is everything all right? I need to speak with Mr. Yates, Harriet said without preamble. I was told he sometimes takes a room here. Mr. Donovan's eyebrows shot up. Miss Dawson, I don't think. It's regarding official Founders' Day business, she added quickly, the lie coming easily in her desperation. Ah. Mr. Donovan still looked dubious, but he stepped back. He's in the last room on the left, but Miss Dawson, your reputation is the least of my concerns right now, she finished for him. Thank you, Mr. Donovan. She walked past him down the narrow hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. This was madness, visiting a man in his room, but desperate times called for desperate measures. She knocked on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the quiet hallway. There was a moment of silence. Then the sound of movement before the door swung open to reveal Vance Yates, shirtless and clearly just out of bed. His dark hair was tousled, and the stubble on his jaw had grown thicker overnight. A thin scar Harriet hadn't noticed before traced a line from his collarbone across his shoulder. Miss Dawson, he said, surprise evident in his voice. This is unexpected. Harriet forced her eyes to stay on his face, refusing to acknowledge the impropriety of the situation. May I come in? I'd rather not discuss our business in the hallway. Vance raised an eyebrow but stepped back, allowing her to enter. The room was small but neat, with a bed, a washstand, and a small table with 2 chairs. His shirt was draped over one of the chairs, and his gun belt hung on a hook by the door. Give me a moment, he said, reaching for his shirt and pulling it on, leaving it unbuttoned as he gestured for her to take a seat at the table. Harriet sat down stiffly, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say on the walk over, but now, faced with the reality of Vance Yates in his room, her carefully prepared speech seemed to evaporate. I assume you've spoken with your father, Vance said, taking the seat opposite her. Yes, Harriet nodded. He confirmed everything you told me. And, Vance prompted when she didn't continue. And I've come to make a counter-offer, Harriet said, finding her voice. I will marry you as you proposed in exchange for you settling my father's debt with Thompson, but I have conditions." Vance leaned back in his chair, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "I'm listening." "First, this will be a marriage in name only," Harriet began, determined to maintain control of the conversation. "I will live in your house and perform the duties of a rancher's wife in public, but we will not. That is, I won't." She faltered, heat rising in her cheeks. "Share my bed," Vance supplied, his expression now openly amused. "Exactly," Harriet said, relieved he'd said it so she didn't have to. "Second, after 1 year, once you've satisfied the terms of your grandfather's will, we will quietly divorce." "Divorce is scandalous," Vance pointed out, "and not easily obtained in Idaho Territory." "We can separate then," Harriet amended. "You can return to your life and I'll return to mine." "And third?" Vance asked, clearly expecting more. "Third, my father keeps full ownership of the store. You'll have no claim on it even as my husband." Vance considered her for a long moment, his dark eyes assessing. "Those are reasonable conditions," he finally said, "but I have some of my own." "Go on," Harriet said cautiously. "First, while I won't force you into my bed, I won't promise to be celibate for a year," Vance said bluntly. "However, I will be discreet and respectful." Harriet felt her cheeks burn again, but she nodded. It was no more than she expected from a man like him. "Second, you will live at my ranch and make a genuine effort to act as my wife in public. That means attending social functions together, supporting my business interests, and generally giving no one cause to suspect our arrangement is anything but a love match." "Agreed," Harriet said, though the thought of pretending to be in love with Vance Yates was daunting. "And third," Vance continued, "you will give our marriage a genuine chance before deciding to end it." Harriet frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you won't enter this with your mind already made up to leave after a year," Vance explained. "You'll approach it with an open mind and heart, as will I. If after a year we still wish to part ways, we'll do so amicably, but we might find we suit each other better than you think." Harriet hadn't expected this. She'd assumed Vance wanted this marriage for purely practical reasons to satisfy his grandfather's will and keep his ranch. The suggestion that he might actually want a real marriage caught her off guard. "Why would you want that?" she asked honestly. "You could have your pick of women once your inheritance is secure." Vance's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Perhaps I'm tired of being alone. Perhaps I've admired you from afar for longer than you realize. Or perhaps I simply think that if I'm going to be married, even temporarily, it might as well be to a woman with spirit and intelligence." Harriet wasn't sure how to respond to that. The idea that Vance Yates might have noticed her before yesterday seemed absurd. They moved in entirely different circles and had spoken perhaps a dozen words to each other prior to their encounter on the street. "Very well," she said finally, "I'll give our arrangement a fair chance, but I make no promises about the outcome. That's all I ask." Vance held out his hand. "Do we have a deal, Miss Dawson?" Harriet looked at his outstretched hand, aware that once she took it, there would be no going back. She was agreeing to marry a man she barely knew, a man with a reputation for trouble, a man whose life could not be more different from her own. But she was also saving her father's store and her family's legacy. She placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses on his palm from years of ranch work. "We have a deal, Mr. Yates." His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "Call me Vance. If we're to be married, we should at least be on a first-name basis." "Vance," Harriet repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "And you may call me Harriet." "Harriet," he echoed, still holding her hand. "A beautiful name for a beautiful woman." She withdrew her hand quickly, uncomfortable with the compliment. "When do you intend to speak with Mr. Thompson?" "Today," Vance said, leaning back in his chair. The sooner this is settled, the better. And I suggest we announce our engagement at the Founders' Day Committee meeting tomorrow evening. It will give the town something to talk about besides your father's gambling." Harriet winced at the blunt reference but nodded. "That seems sensible. And the wedding?" "As soon as possible," Vance replied. "Before the Founders' Day celebration, I think. That gives us just over a week to prepare. A week. In just over a week she would be Mrs. Vance Yates." The thought was terrifying and surreal. "Very well," she agreed, standing up. "I should go. My father will be wondering where I am." Vance rose as well, moving to the door. "I'll call on you this evening after I've spoken with Thompson. We can tell your father together." Harriet nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to look at him. The reality of what she had agreed to was sinking in, and with it came a wave of doubt and fear. "Harriet," Vance said softly, causing her to look up. His expression had softened, the usual mocking glint in his eyes replaced by something more serious. "I know this isn't what you wanted, but I promise to be a good husband to you, in whatever way you'll allow." For a moment, Harriet glimpsed a different Vance Yates than the one she'd always heard about, not the troublemaker or the gambler, but a man capable of kindness and consideration. It was disconcerting and somehow more frightening than his usual bravado. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I'll see you this evening." She slipped past him into the hallway, hurrying toward the exit and the fresh air of the street, feeling as though she had just signed a deal with the devil himself. The day passed in a haze for Harriet. She went through the motions at the store, helping customers and organizing inventory, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating the dramatic change her life was about to undergo. By the time the store closed at 6, her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Her father seemed to notice her distraction, but attributed it to concern over their financial situation. "Uncle James will come through," he assured her as they walked upstairs to their living quarters. "He's never let me down before." Harriet said nothing, knowing that even if Uncle James did send money, it would be too late. She had made her decision, and in a strange way, she felt relieved. The uncertainty was over. Now she just had to face the consequences of her choice. They had barely finished their simple supper of beef stew and bread when there was a knock at the street-level door. "I'll get it," Harriet said, rising quickly. "It's probably just a late customer." She hurried down the stairs, smoothing her hair and straightening her skirt before opening the door to find Vance standing there, looking more respectable than she'd ever seen him. He wore a clean white shirt under a dark vest, and his usual worn cowboy hat had been replaced with a newer one. His face was cleanly shaved, emphasizing the strong line of his jaw and the intensity of his eyes. "Good evening, Harriet," he said, removing his hat. "May I come in?" She stepped back, allowing him to enter. "We've just finished supper. My father's upstairs." "Perfect timing, then." Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. "Thompson has agreed to our terms. Your father's debt is forgiven in exchange for my water rights." Harriet felt a surge of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. "He agreed, just like that." "Not just like that," Vance said with a wry smile. "The water rights are valuable, and he's been after them for a long time. He was suspicious about my sudden willingness to sell, but I convinced him I needed capital for improvements to the ranch before my wedding." "Our wedding," Harriet murmured, the reality of it hitting her anew. "Yes," Vance agreed, his expression softening slightly. "Our wedding, speaking of which." He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small box. "I thought you might want this to make it official." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl set into it. It wasn't ostentatious or flashy, but it was elegant and surprisingly tasteful. "It was my mother's," Vance explained when Harriet didn't speak. "One of the few things I managed to keep after we lost the ranch." Touched despite herself, Harriet reached out tentatively to touch the ring. "It's beautiful. Are you sure you want me to have it?" "She would have wanted you to have it," Vance said simply, taking the ring from the box. "May I?" After a brief hesitation, Harriet extended her left hand, allowing Vance to slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up to find his eyes on hers, intense and unreadable. The moment was broken by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Harriet, who was at the door, Thomas Dawson appeared in the doorway, stopping short when he saw Vance. "Mr. Yates, this is unexpected." "Father," Harriet said, taking a deep breath. "Mr. Yates, Vance has come with news." "Good news." Thomas looked between them, his expression wary. "What news?" Vance stepped forward, extending his hand to Thomas. "Sir, I've come to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." Thomas's mouth fell open in shock. "Marriage? But you hardly know each other." "Sometimes the heart knows what it wants," Vance said smoothly. "Harriet and I have found we share a connection." Thomas looked to Harriet, clearly seeking confirmation or denial. She forced a smile, holding up her left hand to show the ring. "It's true, Father. Vance has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted." "This is very sudden," Thomas said, his brow furrowed. "Harriet, are you sure about this?" "I am," she said with more conviction than she felt. "And there's more. Vance has spoken with Mr. Thompson and settled your debt." Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, then to something like shame. "I see. So this is about the debt." "No, sir," Vance said firmly. "This is about my feelings for your daughter. The matter with Thompson is separate, though I'm pleased I could help resolve it." "Father, please," Harriet said, stepping forward to take his hands. "Be happy for me, for us." Thomas looked between them again, clearly struggling with mixed emotions. "If this is truly what you want, Harriet, I won't stand in your way. But Mr. Yates, I expect you to treat my daughter with the respect and care she deserves." "You have my word," Vance said solemnly. "I'll do everything in my power to make her happy." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then I give you my blessing. When do you plan to marry?" "Next Saturday," Harriet answered. "Before the Founders' Day celebration, we thought Reverend Parker could perform the ceremony at the church." "So soon?" Thomas looked alarmed again. "We see no reason to wait," Vance explained. "And it will allow Harriet to attend the Founders' Day dance as my wife." Thomas seemed to want to argue further, but apparently thought better of it. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order. This calls for a toast." He moved toward the cabinet where he kept a bottle of good whiskey reserved for special occasions. As he poured 3 glasses, Harriet caught Vance's eye. He gave her a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement that their plan was proceeding as intended. She tried to feel triumphant. They had saved the store and her father's reputation, but all she felt was a strange hollowness, as if she had somehow betrayed herself. Thomas handed them each a glass. "To the happy couple," he said, raising his own glass. "May your life together be blessed with happiness and prosperity." "To happiness and prosperity," Vance echoed, his eyes never leaving Harriet's face as they drank. Harriet took a small sip of the whiskey, feeling it burn a path down her throat. She had gotten what she wanted. Her father's store was safe. But as she looked at Vance, with his dark, watchful eyes and his unreadable expression, she wondered what exactly she had traded for it. The next week passed in a whirlwind of preparations. News of their engagement spread through boys like wildfire, generating exactly the kind of gossip Vance had predicted. Some were shocked that proper Harriet Dawson would agree to marry a man like Vance Yates. Others speculated that she must be with child, or that Thomas Dawson had forced the match for financial reasons. The more romantic souls sighed over the unlikely love story, the respectable merchant's daughter and the wild cowboy, brought together by fate. Harriet endured it all with as much grace as she could muster, smiling politely at well-wishers and ignoring the whispers that followed her through town. Vance, true to his word, played the part of the besotted fiancé perfectly, calling at the store each day with small gifts, flowers, a ribbon for her hair, once even a box of chocolates from the confectionery. Clara Holloway, Harriet's closest friend, was initially skeptical of the sudden engagement but seemed won over by Vance's apparent devotion. "He certainly seems smitten with you," Clara remarked as they shopped for fabric for Harriet's wedding dress. "I've never seen a man look at a woman the way he looks at you." "How is that?" Harriet asked, genuinely curious. "As if you're water in the desert," Clara said with a sigh. "As if he can't quite believe you're real. It's terribly romantic." Harriet tried to reconcile this description with the pragmatic arrangement she and Vance had made and found she couldn't. Either Vance was a better actor than she'd given him credit for, or there was something more to his interest in her than she'd understood. The Founders' Day committee meeting had gone much as expected surprise at their announcement, followed by enthusiastic congratulations and an immediate shift in how people treated them. Suddenly, they were a couple, expected to sit together, make decisions together, leave together. It was disconcerting how quickly the world accepted their new status, even as Harriet herself still felt as though she was playing a part in some elaborate charade. The day before the wedding, Vance invited Harriet to visit his ranch. "You should see where you'll be living," he'd said reasonably, and she couldn't argue with that. He picked her up in a smart buggy, helping her up with a gentle hand at her elbow. The touch sent an unexpected shiver through her, which she attributed to nerves. The Yates Ranch was about 5 miles outside of town, a substantial property spread over rolling hills leading down to the Boys River. The main house was larger than Harriet had expected, a 2-story structure of logs and stone with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. A bunkhouse stood nearby, along with a barn, stables, and various outbuildings. "It's impressive," Harriet admitted as Vance helped her down from the buggy. "How many acres did you say you have?" "Just over 5,000 now," Vance replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "I started with the original 500 my grandfather left me and have been adding to it over the years." "And how many cattle?" Harriet asked, genuinely interested despite herself. "Around 3,000 head," Vance said, guiding her toward the house. "Plus about 50 horses. We breed some of the best quarter horses in the territory." "We?" Harriet questioned. "My men and I," Vance clarified. "I have 10 ranch hands year-round, more during roundup and branding." He led her up the steps and opened the front door, standing aside to let her enter first. The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable, with solid, well-made furniture, colorful rugs, and even a few paintings on the walls. It wasn't luxurious, but it was far from the bachelor quarters Harriet had expected. "Mrs. Beecham comes in 3 days a week to cook and clean," Vance explained as he showed her through the large main room that served as both parlor and dining room. "She's been with me since I built the house 5 years ago. The kitchen is through here." The kitchen was modern and well-equipped, with a large cast iron stove, a pump for water at the sink, and ample storage. "You'll have your own room, of course," Vance said, leading her upstairs. "I had Mrs. Beecham prepare it for you." He opened a door to reveal a lovely bedroom with a large 4-poster bed, a dressing table with a mirror, and a small sitting area by the window that overlooked the river in the distance. "It's beautiful," Harriet said, genuinely impressed. "I didn't expect a savage like me to have such a civilized home," Vance suggested, amusement in his voice. Harriet blushed. "I didn't mean it's all right," Vance said, his expression softening. "I know what people say about me, but I've worked hard to build something here, something that will last." There was a vulnerability in his voice that caught Harriet off guard. She had thought of Vance as many things: dangerous, unpredictable, perhaps even calculating, but never vulnerable. "I can see that," she said softly. "You've created something to be proud of." Vance looked at her for a long moment, and Harriet had the distinct impression he was seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. "Thank you," he said finally. "That means more than you might think." They stood there in silence, the air between them charged with something Harriet couldn't quite name. Then Vance cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should show you the rest of the house," he said, his usual composure returning. "My room is across the hall, and there are 2 more bedrooms at the end for guests." The rest of the tour passed without incident, and soon they were back in the buggy, heading toward town. Harriet found herself thinking about the ranch and the life that awaited her there. It wasn't what she had planned for herself, but it wasn't as bleak a prospect as she had initially feared. "Penny for your thoughts," Vance said as they approached the outskirts of Boise. "I was just thinking about the ranch," Harriet admitted. "It's a lovely home." "I'm glad you think so," Vance replied. "I want you to be comfortable there." "I'm sure I will be," Harriet said, then hesitated before adding, "Vance, may I ask you something?" "Anything," he said, glancing at her. "Why did you really propose this arrangement? The truth, please." Vance was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "The truth is complex," he finally said. "Yes, I need to be married to keep my ranch. And yes, I wanted to help your father because I have a grudge against Thompson. But there's more to it." He paused, and Harriet waited, curious despite herself. "I've watched you for years," Vance continued, his voice low. "The way you help everyone in town, the way you stand up for what you believe in, the way you care for your father. You're not like other women I've known, Harriet. You're stronger, more determined. I admire that." Harriet felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. "You've been watching me from a distance," Vance admitted. "I knew someone like you would never look twice at someone like me under normal circumstances. So when this situation arose, I saw an opportunity. Perhaps not the most honorable way to win a wife, but—" He shrugged. "I've never claimed to be an honorable man." Harriet didn't know how to respond to such candor. The idea that Vance Yates had been harboring some kind of admiration for her was both flattering and unsettling. "I can't promise to love you," she said finally, feeling she owed him honesty in return. "But I will try to be a good wife, in the ways I've agreed to." Vance nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's all I ask. For now." The implication that he expected more eventually hung between them as they rode the rest of the way in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the commitment they would make the following day. Saturday dawned clear and warm, a perfect early summer day for a wedding. Harriet stood in her bedroom above the store, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, a pale blue silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, made hastily but skillfully by Mrs. Miller from the millinery, who also did dressmaking. "You look beautiful," Clara said, adjusting the small wreath of wildflowers in Harriet's hair, "like a fairy tale princess." Harriet tried to smile, but her nerves made it more of a grimace. In just an hour she would be Mrs. Vance Yates. The thought still seemed surreal. "Are you nervous?" Clara asked, picking up on her friend's tension. "A little," Harriet admitted. It wasn't a lie, she was nervous, just not for the reasons Clara might assume. "That's normal," Clara assured her. "But Vance adores you, anyone can see that. You're going to be so happy together." Harriet nodded, wishing she could share her friend's certainty. She hadn't seen Vance since their visit to the ranch 2 days ago, as tradition dictated the groom shouldn't see the bride before the wedding. She wondered if he was having second thoughts, if he regretted their arrangement now that it was about to become official. A knock at the door announced her father. "It's time, Harriet," he called. "The buggy is waiting." Taking a deep breath, Harriet picked up her small bouquet of wildflowers and roses. "I'm ready." The church was full when they arrived, nearly everyone in Boise having turned out to witness the unlikely union of Thomas Dawson's daughter and the notorious Vance Yates. Harriet felt the weight of their gazes as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on Vance, who stood waiting for her at the altar. He looked different in his formal suit, more refined, but no less imposing. His dark eyes never left her face as she approached, and there was something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. "You are breathtaking," he whispered as she took her place beside him. Harriet managed a small smile, too nervous to speak. Reverend Parker began the ceremony, his voice filling the small church as he spoke of love and commitment, of the sacred bond between husband and wife. Harriet tried to focus on the words, but all she could think about was Vance beside her, solid and real, about to become her husband. When the time came to exchange vows, Vance's voice was steady and sure. "I, Vance Yates, take thee, Harriet Dawson, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Harriet repeated the vows, her voice softer but no less clear. As she spoke the words "to love and to cherish," she felt a twinge of guilt, knowing she had entered this marriage under false pretenses. Yet part of her wondered if, given time, she might come to care for Vance in some way. He was not the man she had believed him to be. There were depths to him she hadn't expected. "The rings, please," Reverend Parker said. Vance took Harriet's hand, sliding a simple gold band onto her finger to join her mother's pearl ring. His hands were warm and sure, and when he looked into her eyes, she saw a vulnerability there that touched her heart. Then it was her turn to place a ring on his finger, a plain gold band she had purchased yesterday with money her father had insisted on giving her. "By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Idaho, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Parker declared. "You may kiss the bride." This was the moment Harriet had been dreading. They hadn't discussed the kiss, and she had no idea what to expect. Would it be a brief, formal peck, or something more? Vance's hand came up to gently cup her cheek, his eyes searching hers for permission. When she gave a slight nod, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle but not brief, his mouth warm and firm against hers. A strange sensation fluttered in Harriet's stomach, and she found herself responding, her lips softening beneath his. When he pulled away, there was a look of surprise and pleasure in his eyes that matched her own confused feelings. The congregation erupted in applause, but Harriet barely heard them, her mind still reeling from the unexpected effect of Vance's kiss. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Parker announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Vance Yates." Hand in hand, they walked back down the aisle, now husband and wife in the eyes of God and everyone in Boise. The reception was held at the hotel dining room, the only venue in town large enough to accommodate all the guests. There was food, music, dancing, and more congratulations than Harriet could count. Throughout it all, Vance remained by her side, playing the role of devoted husband perfectly. "You're very good at this," Harriet murmured to him as they shared the first dance. "At dancing?" Vance asked, spinning her expertly around the floor. "At pretending," she clarified. "Everyone believes we're madly in love." Something flickered in Vance's eyes. "Who says I'm pretending?" Before Harriet could respond, they were interrupted by Mayor Wilson, eager to offer his congratulations yet again. The moment passed, but Vance's words lingered in Harriet's mind. As the afternoon wore on, Harriet found herself genuinely enjoying the celebration. The weight of the secret she and Vance shared seemed lighter somehow, the deception less burdensome. Perhaps it was the joy of the day, or the relief of knowing her father's debt was settled, or simply the way Vance looked at her when no one else was watching, as if she were the most fascinating creature he had ever encountered. When it came time to leave, Harriet changed from her wedding dress into a practical traveling outfit, a dark blue skirt and jacket with a white shirtwaist. Vance had arranged for their belongings to be taken to the ranch earlier in the day, so all that remained was to say goodbye to her father. "Be happy, my girl," Thomas said, embracing her tightly, "and know that I love you more than anything in this world." "I love you too, father," Harriet said, tears pricking her eyes. Despite everything, she would miss him terribly. "I'll take good care of her, sir," Vance promised, shaking Thomas's hand. "See that you do," Thomas replied, his voice gruff with emotion. Then they were in Vance's buggy, waving goodbye to the crowd of well-wishers as they set off for the ranch for home. The drive was quiet, both of them seemingly lost in thought. The sun was setting as they approached the ranch, casting the landscape in a golden glow. Harriet couldn't help but think it was beautiful, this place that was now her home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Yates," Vance said softly as they pulled up to the house. The title startled Harriet. She was Mrs. Yates now. This man beside her was her husband. The reality of it suddenly seemed overwhelming. Vance must have noticed her discomfort because he made no move to touch her as he helped her down from the buggy. "I'll show you to your room," he said, keeping a respectful distance as they entered the house. The lamps had been lit, and a fire burned in the main room's hearth, making the house warm and inviting. Harriet followed Vance upstairs to the bedroom she had seen on her previous visit, now prepared for her with fresh linens and a vase of wildflowers on the dressing table. "Mrs. Beecham left some cold supper in the kitchen if you're hungry," Vance said, lingering in the doorway. "Or I can bring it up to you if you'd prefer to rest." "Thank you, but I'm not very hungry," Harriet replied, suddenly feeling awkward. "It's been a long day." Vance nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course, I'll leave you to settle in then. Good night, Harriet. Good night." "Vance," she said, the use of his first name still feeling strange on her tongue despite their new status. He hesitated a moment longer, as if wanting to say something more, then simply nodded and closed the door softly behind him. Alone, Harriet let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She was married now, married to a man she barely knew, living in a house that wasn't hers, starting a life she hadn't chosen. Yet as she moved to the window and looked out at the moonlit landscape, she couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. Perhaps this arrangement, born of desperation and practicality, might grow into something more. Perhaps Vance, with his surprising depths and unexpected kindness, might be someone she could learn to care for. Or perhaps, she thought as she turned away from the window, she was simply trying to make the best of a situation she couldn't change. Either way, her new life as Mrs. Vance Yates had begun, and there was no going back now. The first week of marriage passed in a blur of adjustments and discoveries. Harriet found herself learning the rhythms of life on a ranch so different from her orderly existence above the store in town. There were meals to plan for not just herself and Vance, but occasionally for the ranch hands as well. There was a household to manage, though Mrs. Beecham took care of much of the cleaning and cooking on the days she came. And there was Vance himself, a puzzle Harriet couldn't quite solve. In public, he was the attentive, even affectionate husband, his hand often finding the small of her back, his eyes seeking hers across rooms. In private, he was unfailingly polite and considerate, but maintained a careful distance, true to his word not to pressure her for more than she was willing to give. They developed a routine of sorts. Breakfast together, before Vance went out to work with the cattle or horses. Dinner in the evening where they would discuss the day's events. Sometimes they would sit on the porch afterward, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing, his plans for expanding the ranch, her ideas for improving the garden, books they had read, places they had been or wanted to go. To Harriet's surprise, she found Vance to be well-read and thoughtful, with opinions on everything from politics to literature. He had traveled more than she had, having driven cattle as far north as Montana and as far south as Texas. His stories of the open range and the characters he'd met along the way were entertaining and often insightful. "How did you end up with such a reputation for trouble?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, the air warm and scented with summer flowers. "You don't seem like the reckless type, at least not anymore." Vance was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "After we lost the ranch and my parents died, I was angry," he admitted. "Young and stupid and looking for someone to blame. I got into fights, drank too much, made enemies I didn't need to make." He looked down at his hands, strong and tanned from years of outdoor work. "By the time I started to grow up, the reputation was already there. And sometimes it was useful. People are less likely to challenge you when they think you're dangerous." "And the incident at the saloon, the day we first spoke?" Harriet asked. A smile played at the corners of Vance's mouth. "Thompson deliberately provoked me. He knew about my parents, knew I'd never forgive him for what he did. He suggested I might want to purchase your father's debt from him, insinuated some things about you that I didn't appreciate." "About me?" Harriet was surprised. "What could he possibly say about me?" "That you might be available for the right price once your father lost the store," Vance said, his voice hardening. "That a pretty girl like you wouldn't want to work as a shop girl for someone else." Harriet felt a chill despite the warm evening. "And you defended my honor." "I did," Vance confirmed. "Though I'll admit it wasn't entirely selfless. I'd been looking for an excuse to punch Thompson for years." The admission made Harriet laugh unexpectedly, and Vance joined in, the tension of the moment broken. As the days passed, Harriet found herself growing more comfortable with Vance's presence, even looking forward to their evenings together. She enjoyed his dry wit, and the way he listened to her ideas without dismissing them as her father often had. He seemed genuinely interested in her opinions and encouraged her to share them. "You should ride out with me tomorrow," he suggested one evening. "I want to show you the northern pasture. The wildflowers are in bloom and it's quite a sight." Harriet hesitated. She rode adequately but wasn't an experienced horsewoman. "I'm not sure I'd be able to keep up with you." "I'll find you a gentle mount," Vance assured her, "and we'll take it slow. I want you to see all of the ranch, not just the house and yard." "All right," Harriet agreed, pleased by the invitation. "I'd like that." The next day dawned clear and bright. After breakfast, Vance led Harriet to the stables where a beautiful bay mare was saddled and waiting. "This is Daisy," Vance said, patting the horse's neck. "She's steady and gentle, perfect for someone who doesn't ride often." Harriet approached the mare cautiously, reaching out to stroke her velvety nose. "She's lovely." "She is," Vance agreed, "and she's yours." Harriet looked at him in surprise. "Mine, a belated wedding gift," Vance explained. Every rancher's wife should have her own horse. Touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift, Harriet found herself unexpectedly emotional. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's very kind." Vance helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact sent a now familiar flutter through her stomach, a reaction she had been experiencing more frequently as the days passed. They rode out together, Vance on his big black stallion, Harriet on Daisy, who proved to be as gentle and responsive as promised. The day was perfect for riding, with a light breeze tempering the summer heat. Vance showed her the boundaries of the property, pointing out landmarks and explaining his plans for different areas. The northern pasture was as beautiful as he had promised, a rolling expanse of green dotted with vibrant wildflowers in every color imaginable. "It's breathtaking," Harriet said as they dismounted to let the horses graze. "I thought you'd like it," Vance said, spreading a blanket he'd brought for them to sit on. "This is my favorite part of the ranch. When things get overwhelming, I come here to think." "What overwhelms a man like you?" Harriet asked, settling on the blanket beside him. Vance glanced at her, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "The same things that overwhelm anyone, I suppose: responsibility, the future, fear of failure." "You don't seem afraid of anything," Harriet observed. "Everyone's afraid of something," Vance replied. "The trick is not letting it control you." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. "Mrs. Beecham packed us some lunch. Nothing fancy, just bread, cheese, and some of those apple tarts you like." They ate in companionable silence, enjoying the view and the simple food. Afterward, Vance lay back on the blanket, one arm behind his head, looking up at the cloudless sky. "I used to dream about having a place like this," he said, his voice contemplative. "When we lost the family ranch, I promised myself I'd build something better, something no one could take away." Harriet looked down at him, struck by the openness of his expression. In that moment, with his guard down and his face relaxed in the sunlight, he was undeniably handsome. "And you did," she said softly. Vance turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "I did. But I've discovered that land and cattle aren't enough to make a home. A home needs people, family." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. Vance wanted more than a wife in name only. He wanted a true partner, children perhaps, a future built together. Harriet looked away, uncertain how to respond. The attraction she felt toward him was undeniable, growing stronger each day. But attraction wasn't love, and she had entered this marriage with clear expectations about its temporary nature. "We should head back," she said finally, rising from the blanket. "It's getting late." Vance didn't push, simply nodding and standing to gather their things. The ride back to the house was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. That night, lying in her bed, Harriet found sleep elusive. She kept thinking about Vance's words, about the look in his eyes when he spoke of family. Was it possible she could build a real life here, with this man who was so different from what she had expected? The Founders' Day celebration arrived, bringing with it a flurry of activity. As the newest married couple in town, Vance and Harriet were expected to play prominent roles in the festivities. The dance they had been tasked with organizing was the highlight of the celebration, to be held in the town hall on Saturday evening. "You look beautiful," Vance said as Harriet descended the stairs on the evening of the dance, dressed in a new gown of deep green silk that complemented her auburn hair. "Thank you," she replied, pleased by the admiration in his eyes. "You clean up rather well yourself." And he did. In his formal black suit with a crisp white shirt, Vance looked every inch the successful rancher rather than the troublemaker of his reputation. "Shall we, Mrs. Yates?" he asked, offering his arm with a smile that made her heart beat a little faster. "We shall, Mr. Yates," she replied, placing her hand on his arm. The town hall was transformed for the occasion, decorated with bunting and fresh flowers. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the polished floor where couples would soon be dancing. As organizers, Harriet and Vance were responsible for ensuring everything ran smoothly, from the music to the refreshments. "You've done a wonderful job," Mayor Wilson told them as people began to arrive. This is exactly the kind of celebration our founders would have wanted. It was mostly Harriet's doing, Vance said, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. She has an eye for these things. Harriet felt a warm glow at his praise. Over the past weeks, she had come to value Vance's opinion more than she would have thought possible. The evening progressed smoothly, with speeches from the mayor and other town dignitaries, followed by music and dancing. As husband and wife, Vance and Harriet opened the dancing, twirling around the floor with a grace that surprised those who knew Vance only by his rough reputation. "Everyone's watching us," Harriet murmured as they moved through the steps of the waltz. "Let them watch," Vance replied, his hand warm at her waist. "Let them see how lucky I am to have you as my wife." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and Harriet found herself looking up into his eyes, searching for the truth there. What she saw made her breath catch desire, yes, but also a tenderness she hadn't expected. As the evening wore on, Harriet danced with other men as tradition dictated her father, the mayor, Dr. Holloway. But her eyes kept finding Vance across the room, and more often than not, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her skin warm. "You two make a striking couple," Clara said when Harriet joined her near the refreshment table, "and he can't take his eyes off you." "We're still getting used to married life," Harriet said, deflecting the observation. Clara smiled knowingly. "It seems to be agreeing with you." "You're positively glowing." Before Harriet could respond, a commotion at the entrance caught everyone's attention. Edgar Thompson had arrived, and he was heading straight for Vance, who stood talking with several ranchers near the musicians. "Yates," Thompson called, his voice carrying across the room. "I want a word with you." The music faltered, then stopped altogether as the two men faced each other. Thompson was a large man, well-fed and imposing in an expensive suit. At 50, he had the look of someone accustomed to getting his way. "This isn't the time or place, Thompson," Vance said calmly. "We're celebrating Founders' Day." "Founders like me, you mean," Thompson said, his voice slightly slurred. Harriet realized he had been drinking. "I've done more for this town than anyone else here." "That's debatable," Vance replied, his tone still even. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe the next dance is starting." He turned as if to walk away, but Thompson grabbed his arm. "Don't you turn your back on me, boy. I'm not finished." Vance looked down at Thompson's hand on his arm, then back at the older man's face. "Remove your hand, or I'll remove it for you." The tension in the room was palpable. Harriet moved without thinking, crossing to Vance's side. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This is hardly appropriate behavior for a celebration. Perhaps you'd like some coffee. I believe they're serving it in the anteroom." Thompson's bloodshot eyes shifted to her. "Mrs. Yates," he said with a mocking emphasis on her title, "how are you enjoying married life?" "Better than your father enjoyed losing to me at poker, I hope." Harriet felt Vance tense beside her but kept her composure. "My father's affairs are not a topic for public discussion, Mr. Thompson. Now, if you'll excuse us." She took Vance's arm, attempting to lead him away, but Thompson wasn't finished. "Your husband cheated me, you know," he said loudly. "Those water rights were worth twice what I paid for them." Vance turned back, his expression dangerous. "You got exactly what you agreed to, Thompson." "The deal is done." "A deal made under duress," Thompson insisted. "You threatened me." "That's a lie," Vance said, his voice deadly quiet. Thompson smirked. "Is it? I have witnesses who say otherwise." "Enough." Sheriff Mills appeared between them. "Thompson, you're drunk and causing a disturbance. Either quiet down and behave yourself, or I'll escort you out." Thompson glared at the sheriff, then at Vance, but seemed to realize he was outnumbered. "Fine. But this isn't over, Yates." He turned and stalked toward the refreshment table, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. "I'm sorry about that," Sheriff Mills said to Vance and Harriet. "He's been drinking at the Silver Dollar all afternoon, working himself up about something." "It's not your fault, Sheriff," Vance replied. "Thompson's always been a sore loser." The music started again, and gradually the tension in the room dissipated as people returned to dancing and conversation. But Harriet could feel that Vance was still on edge, his body rigid beside her. "Do you want to leave?" she asked quietly. Vance shook his head. "And give Thompson the satisfaction?" "No. Besides, this is your night too. You worked hard on this dance." "Our night," Harriet corrected him. "And it's just a dance. We can leave if you want to." Vance looked down at her, something soft and surprised in his expression. "Thank you," he said. "But I'd rather stay and dance with my wife if she's willing." "She is," Harriet said with a smile, allowing him to lead her back onto the dance floor. As they moved together to the music, Harriet found herself studying Vance's face, seeing the tension gradually ease from his features. "What Thompson said about the water rights," she began hesitantly. "Was there any truth to it?" "No," Vance said firmly. "He agreed to the price and got what he paid for. He's just angry because he thinks he could have gotten more if he'd pushed harder." Harriet nodded, relieved. "And the part about you threatening him?" A ghost of a smile crossed Vance's face. "I may have implied that if he didn't accept the deal, I'd make public certain information about his business practices that wouldn't reflect well on him." "Information like what?" Harriet asked, curious. "Like the fact that he's been cheating small ranchers out of their land for years, using falsified documents and corrupt officials," Vance said. "I've been gathering evidence against him since I was 20 years old." Harriet looked at him in surprise. "That's why you wanted his water rights?" "Not just to help my father, but as part of some larger plan against Thompson." "Yes," Vance admitted. "Though helping your father was a significant part of it. Thompson has hurt too many people in this county, gotten away with too much. Someone needed to stand up to him." "And that someone is you," Harriet said, understanding dawning. "That's why he hates you so much." "That and the fact that I've been buying up land he wanted," Vance confirmed. "My ranch now blocks his access to a significant portion of the river. Without those water rights, his ability to expand is limited." Harriet considered this information, seeing Vance in a new light. So beneath that troublemaker exterior beats the heart of a man seeking justice. Vance laughed softly. "Don't make me sound too noble, Harriet. I have selfish motives too. Revenge for my parents, for one." "Even so," Harriet said, "what you're doing is honorable." Vance's expression sobered. "I hope you still think so when all is said and done. Thompson is a dangerous enemy to make." "We'll face him together," Harriet said without thinking, then realized the implication of her words. "We, together." As if their marriage was real and permanent, Vance seemed to notice too, his hand tightening slightly at her waist. "Together," he repeated softly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart race. The moment was broken by the end of the music, but something had shifted between them. As they mingled with the other guests, accepting congratulations on both their marriage and the success of the dance, Harriet found herself increasingly aware of Vance's presence beside her, of the warmth of his hand at her back, of the way his eyes sought hers across the room. By the time they left the celebration, well past midnight, a new understanding seemed to exist between them. They rode home in the buggy in companionable silence, the night air cool and fragrant with summer blooms. At the ranch, Vance helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist. "Thank you for tonight," he said softly, "for standing by me with Thompson." "Of course," Harriet replied, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. "That's what a wife does, isn't it?" Stands by her husband. Vance's eyes darkened. Is that how you see yourself now, as my wife? Not just in name but in truth? Harriet hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't know, she admitted. Everything is changing so quickly. Not everything, Vance said, his voice low. How I feel about you hasn't changed. It's only grown stronger. Before Harriet could respond, he leaned down and kissed her, a gentle press of lips that quickly deepened as she responded without thinking. His arms went around her, drawing her closer, and she found her hands reaching up to touch his face, his jaw, the soft hair at the nape of his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing quickly, Harriet felt dizzy with new emotions. Vance, I don't say anything, he interrupted gently. Just think about it, about us, about whether this marriage could be more than an arrangement. He pressed a final, soft kiss to her forehead, then stepped back. Good night, Harriet. Good night, she whispered, watching as he turned and walked toward the stables to take care of the horses, his tall figure silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Inside the house, Harriet moved through the quiet rooms in a daze, her mind racing and her lips still tingling from Vance's kiss. She had agreed to marry him to save her father's store, had accepted it as a business arrangement with clear terms and expectations. She hadn't expected to find herself drawn to him, hadn't expected to discover that beneath his rough exterior was a man of principle and passion. As she prepared for bed, Harriet found herself questioning everything she had believed about Vance, about their marriage, about her own heart. She had entered this union expecting it to be temporary, a means to an end. Now, she found herself wondering if it might become something else entirely, something real and lasting. The thought was both frightening and exhilarating. To give her heart to Vance would be a risk like no other she had ever taken. But as she drifted off to sleep, Harriet found herself wondering if it might be a risk worth taking. The weeks following the Founders' Day celebration brought significant changes to Harriet's life on the ranch. After their kiss on the night of the dance, something had shifted in her relationship with Vance. Though he didn't press her for more physical intimacy, there was a new openness between them, a sense of possibilities unfolding. They spent more time together, with Vance teaching Harriet to ride better, showing her every part of the ranch, even including her in discussions about the business. She found she had a head for figures and enjoyed helping him review the ranch accounts, suggesting improvements that might increase profitability. "You're good at this," Vance remarked one evening as they sat at the dining table, ledgers spread out before them. "Better than me, if I'm honest." "I've been keeping the books at the store since I was 16, Harriet explained. "Father always said I had a natural talent for business." "He was right," Vance said, leaning back in his chair. "With you handling the accounts, we could expand the operation considerably. I've been thinking about breeding more horses, focusing on quality rather than quantity." "That makes sense," Harriet agreed, touched by his use of we rather than I. The profit margin on well-bred horses would be higher than cattle, with less land required. They talked well into the night, planning and dreaming together in a way that felt surprisingly natural. When Harriet finally rose to retire to her room, Vance caught her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that sent warmth spreading through her body. "Thank you," he said softly, "for being my partner in this." Harriet smiled, no longer uncomfortable with his touch. "You're welcome. I enjoy working with you." It wasn't quite the declaration of feelings that might have matched the moment, but it was honest. She did enjoy working with him, talking with him, being with him. Whether that enjoyment was growing into something deeper, she wasn't yet ready to say, even to herself. Summer gave way to early fall, bringing cooler temperatures and the annual cattle drive to market. Vance would be gone for nearly 2 weeks, leading his men and 3,000 head of cattle to the railroad at Mountain Home, where the animals would be loaded onto trains bound for eastern markets. The night before his departure, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Harriet had grown to love these quiet evenings, the vast Idaho landscape spread out before them, the scent of sage and pine in the air. "I'll miss this while I'm gone," Vance said, his voice low. "Miss you." Harriet looked over at him, struck by the simplicity and honesty of his statement. "I'll miss you too," she admitted, surprising herself with how true the words felt. Vance reached over, taking her hand in his. His thumb traced circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. "Harriet, before I go, I need to ask you something." "What is it?" she asked, her heart beating faster at his serious tone. "These past months, have they changed anything for you, how you feel about our arrangement about me?" Harriet looked down at their joined hands, considering her answer carefully. "Yes," she said finally. "They have." She looked up to find Vance watching her intently, hope and uncertainty mingled in his expression. "When I agreed to marry you, I thought I knew what kind of man you were," she continued. "I was wrong. You're not at all who I expected." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Vance asked, a hint of humor in his voice despite the tension between them. "A good thing," Harriet assured him. "A very good thing." Vance's hand tightened around hers. "And our marriage, do you still see it as temporary?" This was the question Harriet had been asking herself for weeks now. The answer, she found, was both simpler and more complicated than she had expected. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I care for you, Vance, more than I thought possible when we made our arrangement, but I'm not sure I'm ready to say that means forever." Vance nodded, accepting her answer without pushing for more. "Fair enough," he said. "But know this, Harriet Yates, I love you. I think I have since the moment you stood on that street with broken eggs at your feet, looking at me like I was something you'd scraped off your shoe." The declaration, so unexpected, and yet so perfectly Vance in its bluntness, startled a laugh from Harriet even as tears pricked at her eyes. "That's hardly the most romantic way to tell a woman you love her," she said, trying to hide how deeply his words had affected her. "Maybe not," Vance agreed with a smile. "But it's the truth, and I promised myself I'd tell you before I left in case." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. Cattle drives were dangerous and men sometimes didn't return. "You'll come back," Harriet said firmly, suddenly terrified by the thought that he might not. "You have to come back." "I will," Vance promised, lifting her hand to his lips again. "I have every reason to." They sat in silence after that, hands joined, watching as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. When it was time to go inside, Vance walked Harriet to her door as he always did, but this time, she was the one who initiated the kiss, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. The kiss deepened quickly, months of growing attraction finally finding expression. Vance's arms went around her, pulling her close against his chest, and Harriet found herself responding with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Vance rested his forehead against hers. "If you keep kissing me like that, I might not leave tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with desire. "You have to," Harriet replied, though part of her wished he would stay. "The cattle won't drive themselves to market." Vance laughed softly, pressing one more gentle kiss to her lips before stepping back. 2 weeks, he said, "and then we'll talk more about this about us." 2 weeks, Harriet agreed. "Be safe." "Always," Vance promised, his eyes dark with emotions too complex to name. "Good night, Harriet." "Good night, Vance." As she closed her door behind her, Harriet leaned against it, her heart racing and her mind spinning. Vance loved her. He had said the words plainly, without manipulation or expectation. And though she hadn't said them back, she knew her feelings for him had grown far beyond what she had ever anticipated. Was it love? She wasn't sure. But it was something real and powerful, something that made the thought of him leaving for 2 weeks almost physically painful. Something that made her wonder if perhaps their marriage of convenience might indeed become something neither of them had truly expected, a marriage of love. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the start of a cattle drive. Harriet rose early to help prepare a hearty breakfast for Vance and his men, who would be eating at the ranch before setting out. The kitchen was chaotic with a dozen hungry cowboys, all focused on filling their bellies before the long day ahead. Vance moved among them, giving last-minute instructions, checking that everyone had what they needed. He looked every inch the capable ranch owner, respected by his men and confident in his authority. When it was time for them to leave, Vance found Harriet in the kitchen, cleaning up after the breakfast rush. "We're heading out," he said, his voice low for her ears alone. "You know where everything is if you need it. There's money in the safe in my study if an emergency comes up." "We'll be fine," Harriet assured him, wiping her hands on a towel. "Mrs. Beecham will be here most days, and 2 of the hands are staying behind to watch the place." "Good." Vance hesitated, then reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I meant what I said last night." "I know," Harriet said softly. "I'm not expecting you to say it back," Vance added quickly. "I just wanted you to know where I stand." Harriet nodded, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. "Be careful out there." "I will," Vance promised. Then, as if unable to help himself, he leaned down and kissed her, a brief but fervent press of lips that left her breathless. And then he was gone, striding out to where his men waited with the horses, his tall figure commanding and confident. Harriet watched from the porch as the group rode out, dust rising beneath the hooves of their mounts as they headed toward the pastures where the cattle had been gathered for the drive. The house felt strangely empty without Vance's presence, larger and quieter than before. Harriet threw herself into work cleaning, organizing, making improvements to the garden, riding Daisy around the property to familiarize herself with the land that was now her home. In the evenings, she found herself sitting on the porch alone, watching the sunsets and thinking about Vance, about his declaration of love, about her own confused feelings. She missed him more than she had expected, not just his physical presence but his conversation, his laughter, the way he looked at her as if she were the most fascinating woman in the world. On the 5th day after Vance's departure, Harriet decided to ride into town to visit her father and check on the store. She hadn't been back to Boys since the Founders' Day celebration, and she found herself looking forward to the familiar sights and sounds of the place she had called home for so long. The town was busy as she rode in, merchants opening their shops for the day, women going about their shopping, men heading to work. Several people called out greetings as she passed, addressing her as Mrs. Yates with a respect that still felt strange. She tied Daisy outside the general store and went inside, the bell jingling above her head just as it always had. The familiar scent of coffee, leather, and dry goods enveloped her, bringing a rush of memories. Harriet. Her father emerged from the storeroom, his face lighting up at the sight of her. What a wonderful surprise! They embraced warmly, and Harriet was pleased to see that her father looked well better than he had in months, in fact. The worry lines that had creased his forehead before her marriage seemed less pronounced, and there was a vigor to his movements that had been missing. "You look well, Father," she said, stepping back to study him. "The store seems busy." "It is," Thomas confirmed, leading her toward the back where they could talk privately. Business has picked up considerably since summer, and with the debt to Thompson settled, I've been able to invest in some new inventory that's proving quite popular. Harriet was genuinely pleased to hear it. I'm so glad. I've been worried about you on your own here. No need to worry, Thomas assured her. In fact, I've hired young Peter Johnson to help with the heavy lifting and deliveries. He's a good lad, eager to learn the business. They spent the morning catching up, with Harriet sharing news of the ranch and her father filling her in on town gossip. They carefully avoided the subject of Harriet's marriage itself, whether she was happy, whether she had developed feelings for Vance. It was as if Thomas sensed that those questions were too complicated for a casual conversation. After lunch at the hotel dining room, Harriet decided to visit Clara Holloway before heading back to the ranch. She found her friend at home, delighted by the unexpected visit. "Harriet," Clara exclaimed, pulling her into the parlor. "What a wonderful surprise. I've been dying to hear how married life is treating you. You must tell me everything." Harriet laughed at her friend's enthusiasm. "There's not much to tell. Life on the ranch is busy but satisfying. And your husband?" Clara pressed, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Is he as difficult as everyone says, or have you tamed the wild cowboy?" Harriet smiled at the description. "Vance isn't at all what his reputation suggests," she said truthfully. "He's intelligent, hardworking, and kind in his way." Clara studied her face closely. "You care for him," she said, not a question but a statement. "I can see it in your eyes when you say his name." Harriet felt herself blush. "It's complicated." "Love usually is," Clara replied with a knowing smile, "but it's worth it, don't you think?" Before Harriet could respond, there was a commotion outside, the sound of running feet and shouting voices. "What on earth?" Clara moved to the window, peering out onto the street. "Oh, it's a messenger on horseback. He looks as though he's ridden hard." Harriet joined her at the window, an inexplicable sense of dread settling in her stomach. The messenger had stopped in front of the sheriff's office, his horse lathered with sweat. A small crowd was beginning to gather. "I should go see what's happening," Harriet said, already moving toward the door. "I'll come with you," Clara said, grabbing her shawl. They hurried out into the street, joining the growing crowd around the exhausted messenger and Sheriff Mills. "What's going on?" Harriet asked a man standing near the edge of the group. "Trouble with the Yates cattle drive," the man replied, not recognizing her in the crowd. "Rustlers hit them near the Snake River. There was shooting." Harriet felt her blood run cold. "Casualties?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Don't know yet," the man said with a shrug, "but they sent for the doctor to ride out." Without thinking, Harriet pushed through the crowd toward Sheriff Mills, who was questioning the messenger intently. "Sheriff," she called, "please, what's happened?" "My husband." Mills turned at her voice, his expression softening with recognition. "Mrs. Yates, I was just about to send someone to fetch you." "Is Vance hurt?" she demanded, fear making her voice sharp. "I don't have all the details," Mills said carefully. "But yes, there was an incident with rustlers and there are reports of injuries. Dr. Holloway is preparing to ride out now." "I'm going with him," Harriet said immediately. "Mrs. Yates, it's not safe." "I don't care," she interrupted. "My husband is injured. I'm going to him." The determination in her voice must have convinced the sheriff, because he simply nodded. "Very well. But you'll wait for Dr. Holloway and go with him. I won't have you riding out there alone." Harriet agreed, though the delay chafed at her. Every minute she stood here was another minute Vance was injured, possibly seriously, without her beside him. Clara had followed her through the crowd and now took her arm. "I'll help you prepare," she said, practical as always. "You'll need supplies if you're riding out to a cattle camp." With Clara's help, Harriet quickly gathered what she might need: clean bandages, extra clothing, food, and water for the journey. Dr. Holloway was ready within the hour, his medical bag packed and his horse saddled. "Are you certain you want to do this, Mrs. Yates?" he asked as they prepared to depart. "It's a hard ride and the situation may be difficult." "I'm certain," Harriet replied, mounting Daisy with a determination that surprised even herself. "Vance needs me." The doctor nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Very well, we'll ride together. The messenger will guide us to the camp." The journey was indeed hard, especially as they left the main roads and traveled cross-country, following the route the cattle drive had taken. The messenger, a young cowboy named Mike who had been sent specifically to fetch the doctor, set a pace that was as fast as safety allowed. "How bad is it?" Harriet asked him as they rode, needing to know what they were riding into. "Bad enough," Mike said grimly. "They hit us at dawn, maybe a dozen men, well armed. We weren't expecting trouble so soon in the drive." "And Vance, how badly is he hurt?" Mike hesitated, glancing at Dr. Holloway before answering. "Took a bullet in the shoulder, madam. Lost a fair amount of blood before we could get him patched up. He was conscious when I left, though, ordering everybody around like usual." Harriet felt a mix of relief and continued fear at this news. A shoulder wound could be serious, especially with significant blood loss, but the fact that Vance had been conscious and alert was a good sign. They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and take a quick meal. As night fell, they pressed on, guided by the light of a nearly full moon. It was well past midnight when they finally saw the glow of campfires in the distance. The cattle drive camp was subdued as they rode in, men moving quietly around the fires. The cattle settled in a makeshift corral for the night. Several cowboys came forward to meet them, relief evident on their tired faces. "Doc, thank God," one said, taking Dr. Holloway's horse. "The boss is in the wagon, Mrs. Yates," another said, surprised to see her. "We didn't expect—" "Where is my husband?" Harriet interrupted, dismounting quickly. "This way, madam," the cowboy said, leading her toward a covered wagon at the edge of the camp. Harriet's heart pounded as she approached, fear and anticipation making her hands tremble. The cowboy pulled back the canvas covering the wagon's end, revealing a makeshift bed where Vance lay, his face pale in the lantern light. "Vance," Harriet whispered, climbing into the wagon without hesitation. Vance's eyes opened at her voice, disbelief and joy washing across his face. "Harriet, what are you doing here?" "Where else would I be?" she replied, moving to kneel beside him. "When my husband is injured, my place is with him." Dr. Holloway climbed in behind her, already opening his medical bag. "Let me examine him, Mrs. Yates." Harriet moved aside reluctantly, her eyes never leaving Vance's face. He looked worse than she had expected, his skin pale and clammy, his eyes bright with what might be fever. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged, the cloth stained with blood. "What happened?" she asked as the doctor began to unwrap the bandages. "Rustlers," Vance said, his voice weaker than usual but still determined. "They came at dawn trying to scatter the herd. We fought them off, but not before they did some damage." "And you got yourself shot," Harriet said, a hint of accusation in her voice hiding her fear. A ghost of a smile touched Vance's lips. "Not intentionally." Dr. Holloway completed his examination, his expression serious but not grave. "The bullet went clean through the shoulder, which is good. No major arteries were hit, but you've lost a lot of blood, and there's some sign of infection starting. I'm going to clean the wound thoroughly and stitch it properly, then we'll see about getting that fever down." The next hour was difficult for Harriet, watching as the doctor cleaned and stitched Vance's wound. Vance bore it stoically, his jaw clenched against the pain, his eyes often seeking Harriet's as if drawing strength from her presence. "When it was finally done, Doctor." Holloway gave Vance a dose of laudanum for the pain and stepped out to speak with the trail boss about arrangements for moving Vance back to town. Left alone with her husband, Harriet moved to sit beside him, taking his right hand in both of hers. "You scared me," she admitted softly. "I'm sorry," Vance said, his voice slurred slightly from the medication. "Didn't mean to, I know." Harriet brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, her touch gentle. "But if you ever do something like this again, I'll shoot you myself." Vance chuckled weakly. "Noted." His eyes, heavy with approaching sleep, studied her face. "You came all this way, risked riding at night for me." "Of course I did," Harriet said simply. "Why?" Vance pressed, fighting to keep his eyes open. Harriet looked down at their joined hands, then back at his face. "Because I love you," she said, the words coming easily now that she had almost lost him. "I think I have for a while now. I was just too stubborn to admit it." A smile of pure joy spread across Vance's face. "Say it again," he murmured. "I love you, Vance Yates," Harriet repeated, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to his lips. "Now sleep. I'll be here when you wake up. Promise?" Vance asked, already drifting toward unconsciousness. "I promise," Harriet said softly. "Always." As Vance slipped into sleep, Harriet continued to hold his hand, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The fear that had driven her here was receding, replaced by a quiet certainty. She loved this man, not the one she had agreed to marry in a business arrangement, but the one she had come to know over the months of their marriage. The one who had shown her kindness, respect, and a love she hadn't expected but now treasured above all else. Their marriage, begun as a bet gone wrong, had somehow become the most right thing in her life. And as she sat beside her sleeping husband in the quiet of the night, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The journey back to Boys was slow and careful. Dr. Holloway insisted that Vance travel in the wagon, cushioned with blankets to protect his injured shoulder. Harriet rode beside him, refusing to leave his side despite his protests that she should ride ahead to more comfortable accommodations. "My place is with you," she said firmly when he suggested it again on the second day of travel. "Besides, I've grown quite fond of sleeping under the stars." Vance smiled up at her from his makeshift bed in the wagon. "Have you now?" The refined Miss Dawson, accustomed to proper beds and indoor plumbing, enjoying rough living. "Mrs. Yates," Harriet corrected him with a smile of her own. "And yes, there's something to be said for the simplicity of it. Though I won't pretend I'm not looking forward to a hot bath when we reach town." They reached Boys on the third day, drawing curious stares as they made their way down the main street. Word of the attack on the cattle drive had spread, and townsfolk came out to see the return of the injured rancher and his devoted wife, Dr. Holloway insisted that Vance stay at his house for a few days, where he could monitor the wound for infection and ensure proper healing began before the journey out to the ranch. Harriet agreed, knowing it was the sensible choice, though part of her longed for the privacy and comfort of their own home. News of Vance's injury and Harriet's dash to his side spread through town, transforming their unusual marriage in the eyes of the community. What had been viewed with skepticism or gossip was now seen as a love story, the wild cowboy tamed by love, the merchant's daughter finding unexpected happiness with the most unlikely of men. Clara visited daily, bringing books and treats to help pass the time. Thomas Dawson came too, his initial reservations about Vance clearly softened by the evident care between his daughter and son-in-law. "You look happy," Thomas remarked to Harriet on one such visit, the two of them sitting in Dr. Holloway's garden while Vance rested inside. "Truly happy." I wasn't sure I'd see that when you told me about your arrangement." Harriet looked at her father in surprise. "You knew?" Thomas smiled wryly. "I'm not a fool, Harriet. The timing was too convenient, and you had never shown the slightest interest in Vance Yates before. I guess there was more to the story than you were telling me." "Why didn't you say anything?" Harriet asked, somewhat chagrined to realize her father had seen through their deception from the beginning. "Because I trusted you to make your own decisions," Thomas replied simply. "And because, despite my reservations about Yates, I could see he genuinely cared for you." "He does," Harriet confirmed softly. "And I care for him, love him, in fact. It wasn't part of the plan, but it happened anyway." Thomas nodded, satisfaction in his expression. "The best things in life rarely go according to plan. Your mother and I, for instance, I had intended to court her for at least a year before proposing. Instead, I asked her to marry me 3 weeks after we met, in the middle of a thunderstorm when we were both soaked to the skin." Harriet laughed, delighted by this story she had never heard. "What did she say?" "She said I was a fool for waiting even that long," Thomas replied with a fond smile. "We were married a month later and had 17 wonderful years together before she was taken from us." His expression grew serious. "Life is short and uncertain, Harriet. Love is too precious to waste time questioning it when you find it." Harriet reached out to squeeze her father's hand, grateful for his wisdom and understanding. "Thank you," she said simply. A week after their return to town, Dr. Holloway declared Vance well enough to travel home to the ranch. His shoulder was healing nicely, though he would need to be careful with it for several more weeks. The journey home was made in a comfortable buggy borrowed from Dr. Holloway, with Daisy tethered behind. Harriet drove, Vance sitting beside her with his arm in a sling. It was a beautiful early fall day, the air crisp and clear, the countryside painted in shades of gold and amber. "It's good to be going home," Vance remarked as they left the town behind. "Though I appreciate the doctor's hospitality, I've missed our house, our porch. Our evenings watching the sunset," Harriet added with a smile. "I've missed them too." They traveled in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Vance spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. "Our future." Harriet glanced at him, curious. "What about it? When we made our arrangement, you said you wanted to return to running your father's store after a year," Vance reminded her. "Is that still what you want?" Harriet considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "It's not. I love the store, and I'll always be grateful for the skills I learned there, but my place is with you now at the ranch. It's become my home in a way I never expected." Relief washed across Vance's face. "I'm glad to hear it, because I can't imagine the ranch without you now. You've become as essential to it as the land itself." "Careful, Mr. Yates," Harriet teased. "That almost sounds romantic." "Does it?" Vance's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Well, I wouldn't want to damage my reputation as a hard-bitten cowboy." "I think that reputation was thoroughly damaged the moment you proposed marriage to save a general store," Harriet pointed out. "True enough," Vance agreed with a laugh. "Though in my defense, I had ulterior motives." "Getting back at Thompson?" Harriet asked. "Getting you," Vance corrected. "Thompson was just a convenient excuse." Harriet felt warmth spread through her at his words. "You're saying you would have found some way to marry me regardless, eventually," Vance confirmed. "Though I'll admit, the circumstances worked in my favor. I doubt you would have given me a second glance otherwise." "You might be surprised," Harriet said thoughtfully. "I always noticed you, you know. It was hard not to tall, dark, handsome, with that air of danger about you." "Every unmarried woman in boys noticed you, Vance Yates." "But only one caught my attention," Vance said, his voice softening. "Only one made me want to be a better man, to build something lasting." Harriet felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "We've both changed since we made our arrangement," she said. "I never expected to find happiness in a marriage based on a business deal." "Seems it was right after all," Vance said softly. Harriet turned to look at him, seeing the love and contentment in his eyes. "Yes," she agreed. "It seems it was right after all." They reached the ranch as the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the buildings and land. To Harriet's surprise, smoke rose from the chimney, and lanterns glowed in the windows of the main house. "Mrs. Beecham must have come to prepare for our return," she said as they approached. But when they pulled up to the house, it wasn't just Mrs. Beecham who came out to meet them. The entire ranch staff was there, along with several neighbors from nearby properties, all waiting to welcome them home. "Word traveled fast about the boss's injury," explained Joe, one of the senior ranch hands. "We wanted to make sure you both had a proper welcome home." Touched by the gesture, Harriet helped Vance down from the buggy, careful of his injured shoulder. Together, they entered the house to find the main room decorated with fall flowers and a feast laid out on the dining table. "This is wonderful," Harriet said, looking around at the familiar faces. "Thank you all." The evening that followed was filled with good food, laughter, and stories. The ranch hands regaled them with tales of what had happened in their absence, while neighbors offered assistance with anything they might need during Vance's recovery. It struck Harriet, watching Vance interact with these people who clearly respected and cared for him, how far he had come from the reputation that had preceded him when they first met. These people saw him as she now did, a man of integrity, strength, and quiet leadership. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Harriet and Vance found themselves alone in their home for the first time in weeks. The familiar comfort of the rooms, the scent of pine from the freshly stoked fire, the distant sound of horses in the barn, all of it felt right in a way Harriet hadn't anticipated when she first agreed to live here. "Welcome home, Mrs. Yates," Vance said softly, coming to stand behind her as she gazed out the window at the moonlit landscape. Harriet turned to face him, her heart full of emotions she once would have been afraid to show. "It's good to be home," she said, reaching up to touch his face gently. "With you." Vance leaned down to kiss her, a kiss full of promise and belonging. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his good arm holding her close. "I never thought I'd find this," he admitted, his voice low. "A woman who could see past my reputation, who would stand by me, who would make a house feel like a home. And I never thought I'd find a man who would see me as more than a shopkeeper's daughter," Harriet replied. "Who would value my mind as well as my heart, who would challenge me to be more than I thought I could be." "It seems we were both lucky," Vance said with a smile. "A bet gone wrong that turned out to be exactly right." As they stood together in the warmth of their home, surrounded by the life they had begun to build together, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that their unlikely marriage was the best decision she had ever made. What had begun as a desperate arrangement had blossomed into a love deeper and more real than anything she could have imagined. And as Vance led her upstairs to the bedroom they would now truly share as husband and wife, Harriet silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought them together: the spilled eggs, her father's debt, the unexpected proposal that had changed the course of both their lives. For in finding Vance, she had found not just a husband but a partner, a friend, and a love that would last a lifetime. Epilogue: 5 years later, the spring sun bathed the Yates ranch in golden light as Harriet stood on the porch, watching Vance teach their 3-year-old son, Thomas, to ride his pony in the fenced yard. The little boy sat tall in the small saddle, his face a picture of concentration as he followed his father's instructions. "Gently, Tommy," Vance called. "Just like I showed you. That's it." Thomas's delighted laugh as the pony trotted in a circle made Harriet smile, her hand instinctively cradling the slight swell of her belly where their second child grew. 4 months along now, with the baby due in late summer. The ranch had prospered in the 5 years since their marriage. With Harriet's head for business complementing Vance's knowledge of ranching, they had expanded their operations considerably. The horse breeding program Vance had envisioned had become a notable success, with Yates quarter horses now sought after throughout the territory and beyond. Edgar Thompson had left Boys 3 years ago, his power and influence diminished after Vance had indeed made public the evidence of his corrupt business practices. The man had sold his holdings and moved to California, a fact that gave Vance considerable satisfaction. Thomas Dawson still ran the general store in town, though he now employed 2 full-time assistants and was talking of true retirement in another year or 2. He visited the ranch often, doting on his grandson and maintaining the close relationship he had developed with Vance over the years. "Look, Mama," Thomas called, waving excitedly as he completed another circuit on his pony. "I'm riding all by myself." "I see, sweetheart," Harriet called back. "You're doing wonderfully." Vance looked up at her, pride and love evident in his expression. After 5 years of marriage, he still looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. The dangerous reputation that had once defined him was long forgotten by most, replaced by respect for the successful rancher and family man he had become. As the lesson concluded and Vance lifted their son from the pony, Harriet went to meet them, accepting Thomas's excited hug as he ran to her. "Did you see me, Mama? I rode just like Papa." "You certainly did," Harriet agreed, smoothing his dark hair so like his father's. "You'll be helping with the cattle drive before we know it." "Not for a few years yet," Vance said with a laugh, coming to join them. He wrapped his arm around Harriet's waist, his hand resting protectively over hers on her belly. "How are you feeling?" "Wonderful," Harriet replied truthfully. This pregnancy had been easier than her first, with less morning sickness and more energy. "We're both doing just fine." Vance's smile was tender as he leaned down to kiss her, a gesture that still made her heart beat faster after all these years. "Papa, can we have a picnic by the river?" Thomas asked, tugging at Vance's hand. "Please. You promised last week, but then it rained." "So I did," Vance agreed, ruffling his son's hair. "What do you think, Harriet? Are you up for a picnic?" "That sounds perfect," Harriet said. "I've already packed a basket just in case today was the day." Vance laughed. "Always thinking ahead. That's my wife." As they walked back to the house together, Thomas running ahead to tell Mrs. Beecham about his riding lesson, Vance kept his arm around Harriet, his steps matched to hers. "Happy?" he asked quietly, a question he still asked periodically, as if to reassure himself that their life together was real. Harriet looked up at him, at the face she had grown to love so deeply over the years. The lines around his eyes were a little deeper now, evidence of both laughter and occasional worry. The scar on his shoulder from the bullet wound had faded to a pale line, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. But his eyes were the same dark, intense, and filled with a love that never failed to move her. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. "You?" Vance's smile was slow and sure, the smile of a man who had found his place in the world. "I have everything I never knew I wanted," he said simply. "A home, a family, a wife who loves me despite knowing all my faults. What more could any man ask for?" They paused on the porch, looking out over the ranch that had become the center of their shared life. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, The horses moved in the corral and the river glinted silver in the sunlight. "You ever think about how we started?" Harriet asked. "The arrangement, the conditions, all of it," Vance nodded. "Sometimes. It seems like another lifetime now." "I was so determined that it would be temporary," Harriet recalled with a smile. "A year at most, and then we would go our separate ways." "And now," Vance prompted, though he knew the answer. "Now I can't imagine my life without you," Harriet said softly. "Without this." She gestured to encompass the ranch, their son, the life they had built together. Vance pulled her closer, his arm strong and secure around her waist. "I told you that day in town, didn't I, after you agreed to marry me to save your father's store?" His voice held a touch of humor. "Seems it was right after all." "Yes," Harriet agreed, leaning into his embrace as Thomas came running back toward them, excited about the upcoming picnic. "It seems it was right after all." And as they gathered their son and the picnic basket and set out toward the river, walking together in the spring sunshine, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that their marriage, begun as a bet gone wrong, had turned out to be the most right thing in both their lives.